Sesiyoqala manje umsebenzi. Ngizoqala ngibingelele emakhosini nezinduna eziphakathi kwethu nalabo abamelele isizwe se-Royal Bafokeng. Ngibingelele umdeni weNkosi Mzilikazi kaMashobane omelwe yingane yakhe uNdabezitha ubulelane lobhengula kaMashobane. Bese ngiyathi all protocols observed. I've just, for those who didn't hear me with the language that I was using, I've just acknowledged the presence in our midst of the Royal Bafokeng representatives, the representatives from the royal family of Mzilikazi Mashobane, who are aptly represented here by the grandson, Bulelani Ndabezitha Mashobane. This is a very pivotal moment for us. I have no words to describe what's happening today. Suffice to say, I will start by introducing the firebrand, the CEO, Sarah Forsyth, whose burden it has been to put this thing together for us. A truly historical occasion, which I'm not going to pamper too much with my words. Sarah Forsyth.
Good morning, everyone. There's a lovely group of people gathered here today. It's a pleasure to see all these faces. So, good morning to distinguished royalty, specifically our guest of honor, His Majesty Nkosi Bulelani Lobengula. It is an unbelievable pleasure, privilege, and honor to have you here with us today. We want to thank members of government, the diplomatic corps, the police, honorable guests, and of course, the youth that is present here with us today, who have all joined us at Kedar Heritage Lodge for this momentous and remarkable occasion as we unveil a monument to Mzilikazi Mashobane. Thank you for sharing your time with us, and thank you for caring about our history. I must begin this occasion with a thanks to everybody who has helped us during this day, for this day. Thank you to our sculptor, Adam Madebe, our architect, Mr. Mark Hansen, Vincent Carruthers for his writings on Mzilikazi, which you will see on the memorial, Mr. Andre Vedapo, who will be our keynote speaker today, Mr. Fritz Schroeder, our building manager, Mr. Mark Klein for his production and AV services. Thank you, Mark. Mr. Terence Ball and Mr. Cullen Mackenzie, who you'll hear from shortly from Ancestral Voices. To our MC, Mr. Tula Dlamini. To Vanessa Hetzel for our marketing, and to Mr. Philip Smith for his unparalleled contribution. Thank you to Mr. Godfrey Nyamaropa, our financial director, and importantly, Mrs. Adele Forsyth, our CEO of Recreation Africa, for their support and for their encouragement for this event. Mr. George Kosa, are you here? George? George was supposed to be here. He's our builder. And I just wanted to give him some acknowledgement because George has been working tirelessly erecting this monument for us. And then thank you to the media and all our friends who have joined us today. Then my last thanks, I know it's a lot of thanks, everybody. My last and greatest thanks has to go to my father, Robert Forsyth, who is the founder of Kedar Heritage Lodge. Dad, you made this all possible. It's through your vision that we continue to strive for greatness, to provide knowledge to the peoples of our land, and to promote healing through historical education. I pray, Dad, that you are smiling from above at this incredible feat, and today I honor you. Just short of 2 years ago, I was sitting with my father and we were discussing what we would do for the next unveiling. And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I smiled because I knew that he already knew my answer. And I said, "Let's do Mzilikazi, Dad." And he laughed and he said, "Well, my girl, you have chosen a bloody controversial one." And you know what I see in this conversation is his unending support. For he knows how important Mzilikazi's role was in our history. So Kedar Heritage Lodge is decorated with monuments of men that were and still are very controversial today. We are a home that houses the true history of South Africa, and we do not hide behind controversy. It is important that all these men who changed the face of Southern Africa have their stories told, as these stories are the only things that can help us understand why we are where we are today. I am a true believer in our history heals. When I mentioned to others that I wanted to do Mzilikazi, they said, "Oh no, it's too controversial." And I stopped them in their tracks and I pointed all over the hotel and I gestured at Winston Churchill and Jan Smuts and Rhodes and Kruger and even Gandhi. And I said, how can Mzilikazi be any more controversial than all these men that we have standing here around us? But what they have to teach us is very great, and all of them need to be remembered. It is an honor and a privilege to be hosting a memorial to Mzilikazi Mashobane today. Mzilikazi played a fundamental role in our history, and we cannot even begin to bother speaking of Southern African history unless we speak of his story as well. Historically, we are known for our work on the South African War, or the Anglo-Boer War time period, so I'm sure some of our old friends are sitting here today and wondering why on earth we are unveiling Mzilikazi, as his time was before the South African War. But Mzilikazi's story, believe it or not, can even be linked to the Great Trek, or the Groot Trek. So if I had all day, I would give you all the little details I know of how incredible his story is and how many links it holds in our history. And Mzilikazi will allow us to teach history that spans a lengthier time period, and we'll be able to include more groups of peoples in our displays. I'll finish with this. My father said once at one of his unveilings, "Why do we do this? One, because South Africa has such a rich history, and it's worth telling. And two, he referenced a quote that reads, 'Fear not, you leave us a rich legacy. Rest assured your teachings will not be forgotten. The seed you have sown will not be lost. And the books that have opened your mind and guided you will do the same for us in our minds. It is best not to lose the lessons. We build monuments not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us.' I am very proud today to be unveiling Mzilikazi Mashobane. Thank you all for joining us.
Bayete. Wena wendlu. Okay, so perhaps you're asking why there's so many white people speaking when sikhuluma ngomzilikazi. Okay, yeah, okay. So ngakho-ke, in front of you there is Cullen Mackenzie, but inside this mlungu there is mabhengwane wakwamashina shina wakwambila zotosha wakwatolotola wakadade wakawele masesikotlane. So asiqhubeke kanjalo. So thank you very much to Sarah for welcoming us formally to this event. Ngicela inhlonipho nenjabulo yokuba khona. I'm full of, I'm going to have to translate for myself. I asked if there'd be a translator, so I'll just split Idlo's lam and then some of it will speak in English and some of it will speak in Zulu. Okay, so so it was actually true what Sbalkhulu said when he said that that Cullen Mackenzie isn't here, because that's just one person and he's not there. This is uMabhengwane. And I'm glad ukuthi we started with Izbongo and we started with Amahubo, because that is the way to honor Nkosi. Okay. Kodwa ngizoqhubeka ngezibongo zika Mzilikazi wakwaMashobane. So lezi izibongo ezashiwo yimbongi uXubuthwayo wakwaMlotshwa. So ngithatha isiqephu nje. I took a small section. I'm going to use them as a way of jumping into talking about his history. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Izibongo, calling them praise songs or praise poems doesn't really capture what they are. There are references. There are things which refer to other amakosi. There are things that refer to Udlungwane Gandaba. There are those who refer to other people and to places. And they chart a history through the life of one person. Because no person is inkomedla yodwa. Okay? Right, yeah. No person is a cow that eats alone, for those of you who don't. Okay. So there's no cow who eats alone. There is no individual. Everyone is part of some greater story. So. Inkanyamba emakhanda khanda. Inkanyamba emahlule yakokalanga. Ekhathwe ngezimangele. Yakhathwa ngezinde nezimaqhukulwana. Isiguqa esimabanga amade. Umzilikazi ongamzila wegazi. Iwundlu elizile izimbube. Inyanga engalanga. Lona limtshinga ubethwa zinyoni. Ethi ukugcwala kwesikabhadakazi yasinelwa izinkanyezi zezulu isinelwe inkwenkwezi nesandulela kwalilizela isilimela necela nkobe wayibamba wayipatlaza isijingo sofipha inhloko yehlukana nesiqanti eqobokeni isinambitho siqabe senyele emanyandane hlokoza sanyanta mfoka Mashobane ihlubelo elewusi ibululwane lewusi isikhwebezi esiziziba inhlekwane kudla kubili kuhle kwenhlendla ukuphuma nokungena kuhle kwesaha indla amadoda yakwaSokhumalo isala kutshelwa isala kunyenyezelwa sasenhla kwaSokhumalo indlodlele edlodle ngaduna indlodlele edlodle ngandlandla ngandlonto kamazazela wazihlaba zama ngamagobo kwaqoqi iqha iziyephu kudlungwane udondolo lumashoba ombelebele inqine ekhaphezwe imbozi samahlanga edlinza yambhadama engaqathile uHanesi kubesuthu wena oluju bayede Mthungwa siyabonga. Okay, so for those of you who didn't understand that, you could hear that there's an emotion that's part of it that moves. It's not just a war song at all. The amazing thing for me is that you can hear that he is associated with the cosmos. So for those of you who know what Inkwenkwezi is, and Isandulela and Ikelankobe, okay, those are the stars that are seen in the sky that signify the passing of seasons. He is so much more than a human being. He is a cosmic force. So yes, he's controversial, but he's also powerful, deeply powerful. Now, what I wanted to talk about is the way that his journey is one which was not the first to come up onto the Highveld, and there are others up here who are called Amandebele. So let's go back a bit. Okay. Now, there was a movement of people who came up. They are the sons of Musa. Do you know of the sons of Musa? Yes. Okay. Manala, Kekana, Muhatuba, and Nzunza. Okay. Now, they were the first to be called Amandebele because Abenehau El Kulu. Okay. So they were called the people who debeled. Okay. So they came up onto the Highveld. Bafika Kona and Abesutu and Abapedi and others were at first very terrified of them, obviously. You can see Uguti Niasabega Pela. Okay. So, and you can see that you're terrified. Okay, so they came up here, and that was about 800 years ago. So in case anyone's wondering about time periods here, it's a long time ago. And I know that we have a historian who's going to give us a bit more detail about these things. So I'm not stepping on toes. I'm just giving some of the chies, I suppose it's called, ngesbonu. Okay. the idea is that they stayed here so long that they integrated. So they started speaking Setswana, Sesotho, Sepedi. But that history is not lost. That history is contained in their praises and is contained in their oral history. And it's something that Ndate Ball is going to be talking about just now, wherever he is. I can't see. There he is. Okay, great. So he'll be talking about the way that the oral history was not forgotten, no matter how much nonsense happened in the last 100 years. Okay. Now, the other thing that we wanted to talk about is, why is it that ngaqala ngesiZulu kodwa nina ningabathwakazi hayi amaZulu? Okay. Nivele lapho kubizwa kwamanje kwaZulu, kodwa it wasn't the way that it was before. So that eastern area of the country that people from Joburg just call Durban, okay, isn't actually Durban, all right? That coastal plain, there were groups of people that were in control. And uZulu was just one small group within it, okay? Makebo. Okay. Angifuna ukudelela, okay? Ayikho indelelo. There's no disrespect, but we're talking 1780s, okay? There were lots of different groups. The biggest group was the Amandwandwe. Okay? Followed closely by Ubani. Abamthethwa. Okay, so Abamthethwa, okay? Then there were Amantungwa, okay? There were Abakwabe, Pagatwayo. Okay, the Pagatwayos, exactly. Yes, there we go, okay? And there were others, right? But they all populated that coastal area. And what happened? They had many children. They moved, they grew, and they started bumping into others. And there was a bit of utugu, some friction, okay? Yeah, so, and in fact, I know, someone said that, yes, okay, so utugu is the nice way of talking about the friction that occurs between groups of people when they're in the same space and they're competing for resources, okay? Hey, izinkomo zakho zingene emasimini ami. Ngizokwenzani? Ngizokuhlawula, okay? So your cattle came into my fields, so now I'm going to fine you, okay? That quickly escalates to impi, okay? Warfare, all right. Now, in terms of warfare, we all know the story of Ushaga and Ikra, okay? The spear. Now, that spear was revolutionary because it changed the way that fighting happened, okay? It wasn't Isjula, okay? You just ju, and then you wait and see what happens. No. Uyangena lapho, ngene, Ikra, okay? Ngene kanje, okay? So there's no messing around, all right? It's hand-to-hand combat. And that changed everything. So it meant that the people who had isbindi, who were courageous, who had a lot of liver, okay? They were the ones who were able to conquer. And quickly what happened is that the group started to form. And Mzilikazi, Nkosi, was actually allied to the Amandwandwe. And we know this story. We know what happened. We know that Uyise, his father, was murdered, was taken out by Uzwide. And that pain, knowing that his own grandfather had killed his father, led him to say, Nyambuga, ngiwele ku Lungwane. I'm crossing over to Ulungwane Kandaba. Ilembe leqamanye amalembe ngokukhalipha kwalo. Okay? Ushaga kasishayeki. Okay. So they crossed to the person that the people speaking English in the audience, that's Shaka. Okay? So they crossed to him, all right? But for everyone else, it's Ilembe. Okay? Ilembe. Okay. Isilo Sagwatuguza and Isilo Sagwablawayo. Okay, so there is an obvious connection between the two nations. We know that Mzilikazi was one of Shaka's Amakawe. Okay. he was one of the Izinduna Zempi. And we know that he fought alongside him against Zwide and Amapela Ake, because his regiments were called Amapela, the cockroaches, for everyone who needs a translation. It's an unfortunate name, you could think of it this way, that they were very hard to kill. Yes, okay. So that warfare raged for a long time, but eventually the people who were allied with the Amandwandwe, which included the Ngumalo, so Shangana, you know Amashangana? Yes? Everyone knows, there's a giggle coming from here. Okay, so Amashangana, okay. Zwangendaba Gajele, okay, and Zwangendaba ended up in the north of Malawi, where there are still people who practice Istembu and have the traditions of Amazulu. Okay, the Ngunis, yes, Amanguni. Thank you, that's better, because Amazulu is just... I see, I'm loving the energy I'm getting from you, Mnumzan. Siyabonga. Okay, so those people then spread and they moved. And the story that the storybooks tell is that Ilembe was victorious and conquered and then set up a kingdom. But it wasn't a story as simple as that. Because Mzilikazi, Nkosi, he wanted more. And there are various reasons why the relationship broke down. One of them was that he was sent on a raid to get cattle. And he got those cattle and then was told, no, you must come back. And he said, Ngezami lezi nkomo. Ngezami, angeke, no, angeke. Ngikhathele lento. Okay, these are my cattle, I'm tired of this nonsense. So he kept going. And Ilembe didn't let that slide. Okay, he sent Amabuto to go and get the cattle back. And there was a battle near the present-day town of Ifiliti. Okay, still below Undi, below the escarpment. Okay, yes. Ebakulusini, Mkabai, Gachama. Okay, Yamaz Mkabai. Okay, we talk. Sarah mentioned very famous men, but there were famous women too. Okay, Shaka's aunt Mkabai was powerful. She didn't marry. She refused to, and she started her own nation called the Abakulusi. Okay, near Filiti. Okay, Emondlo. Now today. Okay, it's not quite. Doesn't sit right in the mouth, but they fought there, and it was brutal. And many people died on the side of Mzilikazi. And some of his own sons deserted him, including Sholo Sholo. This is a part of the history that Mr. Ball will get to in a moment, I'm sure. Okay. But what happened is that then he left KZN and he came up to Ermelo. And the people who came with us. So now I was privileged, Abatwagazi, bekumnandi kakhulu ukuhlangana nani namuhla ekseni ngoba ngabona ukuthi kunabantu bakwaDlamini kunabanye bakwaDuwe kunabanye. I'm like, how lezi zibongo zivelaphi? Where do these surnames come from? Now these are the regiments, and I'm going to read this out, and this is where I'll end. The Amabuto that went with Mzilikazi in his journey over the ridge, over the escarpment, up onto the Highveld. The Amagogo, okay, Aholwangu, Makregeni, Stole, Jobe, okay. The Amacheche, who were led by Sifo Masugu, okay. Listen to the surnames, okay. Masugu, Nang, okay. The Babambeni, led by Dagamela Ngube. There must be a Ngube in the house. Is there a Ngube? Bakon, Nang, okay, good, okay. The Dibintlangu, led by Mleche Tebe. Okay? Unabagwa Tebe? Tebe. Okay, good. Yo, ukpela abelungu bayahlula. Okay. Ubhalwela ubhalumlungu so angazi uThebe. TH uthe. Okay, kuhle ngizoshintsha, okay? Ekuqeni, okay? Eqeni, okay? Kuholwa ngumleche Ndeweni, okay, ku right. See, I'm doing fact checking here in case anyone's wondering. Okay, cool. Godlwayo. Ibutho elibizwa ngogodlwayo. Okay. Uthambisa amahubo mafa. Okay. Indinana kuholwa ngu Mfangilele Machazi. Induba Mashazi. Okay. Induba nguholwe ngu Lotshe Hlabangana. Okay. Ingwegwe kuholwa ngu Mkanyeli Masuku. Okay. Umunyu Masuku. Mkanyeli. Mkanyeli. Okay, ukha. Ngizoshintsha futhi. Inhlambane kuholwa ngu Thambo Ndeweni futhi. Okay. Inqama kuholwa ngu Somhlolo Matena. Mathema. Okay, kuhle ngizoshintsha futhi. Okay. Inqobo kuholwa ngu Mazwi Umede Phakathwayo. Bapho Phakathwayo. Phakathwayo. Okay. All right. Insinda kuholwe ngu Chuwe Gwebu. Okay. Gwebu, ogwebu bakhona. Abekho. Oh, okay. Insingo uholwe nguSomabulane Dlodlo. Intemba uholwe ngumJojo Mlotshwa. AbakwaMlotshwa bakhona ngithi. Bakhona. Okay. Intunta uholwa ngumhabahaba. Mkwanazi. Oh, nango. Oh, Mkwanazi. Hey, musho. Hey. Ngicela injabulo. You see, idlozi likhona. Abaphansi bakhona. Okay. Inyathi kuholwa nguNtabene Gwebu. Inqa engithanda legama. Inqa. For those of you who don't speak Isintu, Inqa is like the cause, the reason. You call a regiment the reason. I'll give you a reason. Yeah, that's kind of what they're saying, okay? All right, so Inqa kuholwa nguNtshumane Khanye. Noma ukanye. Khanye. Oh, you see. Okay, right. Ngizoshintsha futhi ngibhala u-H. Okay, so inzwanananzi. Okay. Inzwananzi kuholwa nguMpiliwa Magutshwa. Smelane. Smelane. Okay, all right. Sengiyafunda. Ngifunda kuze ngigogode noma ngimpunga kanje. Okay. Sorry, I'm learning. I'll carry on learning until I walk stooping, even though I am as grey as I am. Okay. So, isiphezi, ibutho elibizwa ngesiphezi, kuholwa ngubani? Scott. Okay, fantastic. Makundela. Okay, muhle. Mabhukudwane. Kuholwa nguMayeke Mthethwa. Nyambose. Hey, nangu Nyambose. Okay. Mahlokohloko. Hey, kuholwa nguMbambelele Hlabangana. Makholoza. Kuholwa nguMankanyana Thebe. Mbuyazwe. This is an interesting one. Kuholwa nguMhliphi. How? Mkhaliphi? Mhliphi? Angazi. Ndeweni. Mkhaliphi nami ngicabanga kanjalo. Okay. Umhlahlandlela kuholwa nguGwabalanda Mathe. Yebo. Mathe, omathe bakhona. Bakhona. Okay, kuhle. Mzinyathi. Ngithanda lengama futhi. Okay, so Mzinyathi kuhola nguMajijili Gwebu. Okay. Unyama yendlovu. Yo. Masuku. Nangu Masuku futhi. And okugcina oyengweni kuholwa ngumlotha Khumalo Ntungwa. Yilapho ngizogcina khona. Bayede. Asibonge.
No, without further ado, I'm going to call on the passionate Henry Wenderpool. He's going to give us a keynote address. He's one of the drivers of this event and always very supportive of the things that we do.
It is my great privilege today to tell you one of the most remarkable stories of Southern African history, the story of Nkosi Mazilikazi Mashobane and his Ndebele people. At the beginning of this presentation, I need to give thanks and acknowledgement to some people who've helped me a great deal in my preparation. Firstly, the American scholar R. Kent Rasmussen, who did his doctoral research and then published this book in 1978, Migrant Kingdom. It's a wonderful way of summing up the history all the way from 1821 to 1839 of the Ndebele. Mzilikazi's Ndebele in South Africa. I have depended very heavily on his research, and you will see most of the maps in my presentation are from his book. And then I am delighted that South African heritage publishers are represented here today and playing such a prominent role in this event. They are doing a fantastic job of making this African history known. And they have published 4 books about Mzilikazi. I'm showing you the images now. Each of these books is 48 pages. They're beautifully illustrated. They're written at a popular level. Much of the detail of the story that for time reasons I'm simply not able to include today, you will find in these books. So I encourage everybody to buy these books and read them. They are wonderful books. And then thanks to Dr. Julius Pistorius, who I'm very pleased is here today. Julius is an archaeologist. He's been working in the Rustenburg area for decades, excavating many Tswana sites, but also Ndebele sites, and has written some fascinating articles about his findings. And then last but not least, my thanks to Vincent Carruthers, who unfortunately could not be here today. Thank you, Vincent, for your careful research about Magaliesburg history in general, and specifically about Mzilikazi and the Ndebele people. And then I just want to give you a sense of just how big the area is that our story covers. And there you'll see a modern map of Southern Africa, and the red rectangle defines the area that we will be talking about. And this really is a whirlwind tour. I have 19 years of action-packed history to tell you about in 30 minutes. It's going to be a whirlwind tour. I'll give it my best shot. So we'll be starting in what is today northern KwaZulu-Natal, and moving up into Mpumalanga, and these, of course, are all the modern place names, then down to the Vaal River, up past Johannesburg, onto Pretoria, west to Rustenburg, further west to the Mariko area, and then up through Botswana into Zimbabwe and the Bulawayo area. Callum has done a fantastic job of introducing the conflicts in what is today KwaZulu-Natal. I'm going to move over that very briefly, and I'm really just summarizing what he has already told you. Our story begins at the Black Umfolozi River. And we are in the late 18th century, and the Khomalo people are settled near to the Black Umfolozi River. And it's a lush, fertile, subtropical area of Southern Africa. But as Callum mentioned, the Nguni people in that area had prospered, they had done well, had many children, much cattle, and there was friction. And the situation at the late 18th century, and here we have the first of Dr. Rasmussen's maps, and there underlined in red, you see Khumalo, and there was more than one division of the Khumalo clan. In the north, you had the senior clan under Nkosi Mashobane. To his south, another division of the Khumalo ruled by his nephew Donda. To their east were the powerful Ndwandwe clan under Zwide. To their southeast, another powerful clan gaining in strength, the Mtetwa under Dingiswayo. And then to the south, in those days, small clan, but destined to become a mighty nation, the Zulu. That was the situation, late 18th century. Sometime in the early 1790s, Mashobane married one of the daughters of Zwide, of the Ndwandwe, and her name was Nompetu. And yes, a marriage, but no doubt also a political alliance. And probably about 1795, they had a son. And Nompetu named him Mzilikazi, which means great road. And it was a mysteriously prophetic name, given the history that was to come. Interestingly enough, Mashobane sent Nompetu and baby Mzilikazi to live with his grandfather Zwide. He was the heir. There were possibly always the possibility of political intrigues in the court. Perhaps it was a safer place for Mzilikazi, the heir to the throne, to be living. And this was a time of increasing conflict. Callum has talked a little bit about the change in the way of warfare. This illustration, this was the old way of fighting. This is a drawing of some Tswana warriors by a very talented artist named Charles Bell. We'll come back to him later in the presentation. But you see the long throwing spears, the small H-shaped shields. Shaka changed all of that. He introduced the ikla, the short stabbing spear, and the large oval shield, which was both a shield and a means of pushing aside your opponent's shield and exposing his chest for the thrust of the ikla. And this was a far more deadly kind of warfare. And in the situation of growing conflict, war broke out between the Ndwandwe and the Mtetwa. And the Kamalo allied with the Ndwandwe, the Zulu under Shaka allied with Mtetwa under Dingiswayo. But Zwide was a very clever man. He set a trap for Dingiswayo, and he was captured and he was executed. And he then wanted to do the same with Shaka. But Donda, remember, he was the nephew of Mashobane, ruling the Kamala in the south. He found out about Zwide's plan, and he warned Shaka. And so Shaka escaped from the trap. And of course, Zwide was enraged. This was to him an act of betrayal. And he had Donda executed, but not only that, he had Donda's uncle Mashobane executed as well, and installed the young Mzilikazi as chief of the Kamalo in the place of his father, Mashobane. And Mzilikazi could see that there was growing conflict between the Ndwandwe and Shaka and all the clans now under him, the AmaZulu growing in power and importance, the Mtetwa and their other allies. And Mzilikazi took a momentous decision. He decided to switch his allegiance to Shaka. Yes, Zwide was his grandfather, but had Zwide not murdered his own father, Mashobane? He made the decision. He moved over to Shaka. Shaka now resumed his warfare against the Ndwandwe, and they were comprehensively defeated. Zwide fled north. He never returned to Zululand. And Mzilikazi now was one of the rising stars in Shaka's army. And as Callum mentioned, he was then sent on a cattle raiding expedition to the northwest against a Sotho community under the chief Ranisi. And it was successful. Much cattle were captured. And then Shaka, this is now the year 1821, he took a momentous decision. He would keep the cattle for himself. I'm sure that he revered Shaka as a great chief. But Mzilikazi had ambitions of his own to become great. We have a saying in these parts, two bulls cannot share a kraal. And here were these two young, strong bulls. One of them needed to find a new kraal. It was Mzilikazi. Now he knew Shaka would come after him. And so, as Caleb mentioned, they took a stand, Mzilikazi with his Kamala people, but ultimately their defenses were breached. Many were killed. They had to flee north. And so Mzilikazi moved northwards over what we would now call the Mpumalanga Drakensberg, onto the Mpumalanga Highveld in 1821. And so the Great Road had begun. And as they went, they attacked other communities and they seized the cattle. But not only that, Mzilikazi was a very wise young man. At the start of this great journey, he had just a few hundred followers, and he knew if he was going to become a great king, he needed more people. So as these communities were defeated, the young men were taken in as under Mzilikazi leadership, and they became warriors, and the young women were brought in and they became wives. And so progressively, Mzilikazi's people grew. The first community to be attacked, the Baputing. Next, the Nzunza, Ndebele. Again, Callum gave us a little bit of the history there. And they too were comprehensively defeated. Mzilikazi then stayed with his people, who by now were being called the Matabele, most likely meaning something like those who take cover behind their shields, and brought over into the Nguni languages as Amand Ndebele, and so Ndebele today. So the Ndunza having been defeated, the Matabele stayed in that area for about a year. But in 1822, they were on the move again. And the next to be attacked were the Bakoni. They're underlined in orange. And the Bakoni, this was a very sophisticated culture. This is now the area around what is today Leidenburg, Machadodorp, Waterval-Boven. They had sophisticated systems of agricultural terraces. You can see that in the bottom left of that photograph. Large stone-walled villages in the circular pattern with the cattle kraals in the center, roads linking these villages, a sophisticated culture, but no match for Mzilikazi and his Matabele with their military prowess. And so the Bakoni too were overwhelmed, but again, many of the young people were incorporated into the Ndebele. Next, the Pedi, also known today as the Northern Sotho. They had their mountain strongholds there between the Olifants River and what the Voortrekkers later called the Steelpoort Rivier. I think the Olifants is the Baluli River. But those mountain strongholds were not strong enough to keep the Ndebele out. And so the Pedi too were overwhelmed, and most of them fled to the north. So that was the year 1822. Again, Mzilikazi stayed in that area for about a year, and then he made a big move to the south. And the reason probably was that there was a serious drought. And so again, this wise young king took the decision to head for the biggest river for 100 kilometers around. And he went south to the river that was known then as the Lekwa. Today we call it the Vaal. And drought problem solved. And so the Ndebele arrived here in the year 1823. And for a while enjoyed some peace in this area. And having arrived there, again, one of the Sotho-Tswana communities was there, the Bakudu. They too were attacked. They were overwhelmed. And they moved to the west and joined up with a large number of other Sotho and Tswana clans who had been displaced by the Mtekane, the Difikani. And there's this huge upheaval of peoples. And they all moved west for a couple of 100 kilometers. And they attacked another Tswana community, the Batlaping, at Ditakong. And Ditakong was very close to a mission station called Kuruman. And there was a young Scottish missionary there who is going to be very important for our story a bit later. His name was Robert Moffat. And Robert Moffat was a man of peace, but he was not going to stand by and do nothing when he saw the Batlaping being attacked. And so he organized a few hundred Griquas to defend Ditakong. Who were these Griquas? They were of mixed race, mostly European fathers, Dutch, German from the Cape, but Kukun mothers, Khoi Khoi. But they had adopted the European way of doing things. So wore European-style clothing, they were expert horsemen, and they had guns. They used firearms. So just a few hundred Griquas were able to repel these thousands of Sotho and Tswana warriors who attacked Ditakong. And this was Robert Moffat's doing, and the news spread far and wide. And it seems that Mzilikazi also heard what had been accomplished by Robert Moffat. We're going to hear more about the Griquas very shortly. So now the Mzilikazi and his people are settled on both sides of the Vaal River. It seemed to them that they were going to enjoy some peace in this area, although they themselves continued with cattle raiding off to the west, particularly against the Barolong, the Bakwena. But from about 1825, they began to be harassed by the Griqua and their allies, the Korana, who were again one of the Kukun communities, coming on cattle raiding expeditions. And from the year 1825 to 1827, the Ndebele were subjected to at least 7 of these cattle raids by the Griqua and the Korana. By 1827, Mzilikazi had enough, and he decided to move his people northwards into an area that we're very familiar with, the Magaliesberg. Why the Magaliesberg? Firstly, this again was a well-watered, very fertile area, but also the mountain range that you see in this wonderful aerial photograph was a physical barrier that offered some protection against the Griqua and Korana cattle raids. So probably in about July 1827, the Matabele streamed northwards through the pass that is today known as Commando Neck and moved to the north of the Magaliesberg. And there were many Tswana communities in the Magaliesberg region, several branches of the Bakwena, the Bafokeng, of course, right in this area. I've marked Kedar there with a little green dot just to help you see where we are. To the north, you see the circular mountain of the Pilansberg, and just a little way north of that with the Bakhatla Bachafela. To the west, the Bahuruchi. And let's not forget the Bapau, Bamachale. Again, they were actually Nguni people, but as Kala mentioned, had moved up onto the Highveld and had become completely assimilated to the Tswana in their language and their culture. And of course, Bapau Bamochale, their chief, Mochale, the Magaliesberg is named after him. But again, these Tswana communities were no match for Mzilikazi and his Matabele. They were quickly overwhelmed. And now the Ndebele, the Matabele, settled particularly on the northern side of the Magaliesberg. And Mzilikazi now built for himself 3 royal kraals. The furthest east was Kungwini, where the Apis River cuts through the Magaliesberg. Today we call it Wonderboompoort. But further to the west was Dinaneni, just to the north of the pass that we call Silkart's Neck, and of course it is named after Mzilikazi. And then here in the Rustenburg area, probably, was the largest of all of these royal kraals, Slatlandlela. And it's this site that Dr. Julius Pistorius has done some fascinating excavations at. Interestingly enough, all 3 of these royal kraals were close to important passes over the Magaliesberg. They were also centers of military power. But even here, having moved north of the Magaliesberg in 1827, Mzilikazi was still not immune from the Griqua and Korana cattle raids. In 1828, a group of them, under a man by the name of Jan Bloem, came up through the Olifantsneck Pass. They moved all, and that's where the R24 crosses the Magaliesberg today. They moved all the way east to the Uri River, the Crocodile River, Hardebeespoort Dam, that area. And they captured thousands of head of cattle and then headed back to Olifantsneck and back to the southwest to take the cattle home. But they made a very big mistake. After capturing all of this cattle, they decided to stop for a party and a sleepover. This was a very bad idea. In the night, they were surrounded, they were massacred. If you steal cattle from Mzilikazi, the best to just keep moving. You know. So that was 1828, still being harassed by these Griqua and Korana cattle raids. So there, Dr. Rasmussen gives us an indication of the area that the Ndebele occupied during this time, the solid shaded area where they actually lived. But look at that wider ring. This was the ring of indirect rule, as he calls it, all the way down to the Vaal River. And Mzilikazi, in fact, made that area between the Magaliesberg, running south to the Vaal, a no-go zone. People were not allowed to live there. It was a buffer zone against those attacks from the Griqua and the Korana. 1829, Mzilikazi had a very important visitor, the missionary, Robert Moffat. And how did that come about? Well, Mzilikazi had heard about Robert Moffat. He'd heard of the wonderful things that were being done in Kuruman. Robert Moffat, although he was a missionary and he was all about the Word of God and converting people to Christianity, he was a very practical man. So he taught people how to dig water furrows, to bring the water from the eye of Kuruman into the fields. He taught them how to grow crops more effectively, how to grow more food. He taught them carpentry and metalwork. He taught them how to read. And Mzilikazi heard all of these things, and he wanted that for his people. But he had also heard about how Robert Moffat had organized for a few hundred Griquas to defend Ditakom. He was interested in that as well. And so Mzilikazi sent some of these Indunas to Kuruman, hundreds of kilometers, to go and fetch Robert Moffat and bring him. Robert Moffat was reluctant. He had heard about this fierce ruler, Mzilikazi, but he came. And it was the beginning of an amazing and very strong friendship between these two men. And Mzilikazi developed this warm affection for Robert Moffat. He began to call him Mashobane, father. They were about the same age, but he revered this man and he trusted him completely. And Robert Moffat was a man you could trust completely. So this was a very important visit, and we'll see it had further consequences. 1831, believe it or not, the Griqua and the Korana came back again. This time under a man by the name of Gert Goeman. And believe it or not, they made the same mistake all over again. Captured the cattle, stopped for a party, stopped to sleep. Not far from here, little conical kopje, just near the Bospoort Dam. The Matabele surrounded them in the middle of the night. They were massacred almost to a man, and all their horses were killed. And for decades afterwards, that conical kopje was strewn with the bones of men and horses and broken firearms, became known as Moordkop. Same mistake, repeated all over again. About 1832, Mzilikazi took another momentous decision. He decided to move the center of his power further to the west. May have had something to do with those Griqua and Korana raids. Perhaps he felt moving west into the upper Marika River Valley was a more defensible position, but it probably also had a lot to do with the increasing rise in power of the Zulu nation. Of course, now they were under their chief, Dingaan. You will remember the story. Dingaan assassinated his half-brother Shaka in 1828, and increased, the power increased. And so Mzilikazi established two new royal kraals to the west along the Marika River. The first of them, Mosecha, very close to where the town of Zeerust is today. The other one was Gabeni, about 60 kilometers north of that. And obviously the intention was to move further to the west. And sure enough, in about June 1832, the Zulu came. And those Zulu warriors marched more than 500 kilometers from Zululand to come and deal with the Ndebele. Kungwini was destroyed. Next, Dinaneni was destroyed north of Silkhart's Neck. But at that point, the Ndebele managed to halt the Zulu advance, and they returned home. So in the end, the battle was indecisive. But all of this gave impetus to Mzilikazi's decision to move further to the west, to Moseja and Gabeni. So that's 1832. 1835, Mzilikazi had another very important visitor. His name was Dr. Andrew Smith. He was a British Army doctor, medical doctor, but he put together a large expedition to travel all the way from Cape Town, via Graafrenet, via Kuruman, where Robert Moffat was, and then into the interior. Firstly, for scientific research. They collected many specimens of animals and birds and so on, but it also had political objectives. And one of his important objectives was to meet with this great king that they kept hearing about, Mzilikazi. And as I say, they came via Kuruman, and they came with Robert Moffat. And increasingly, Mzilikazi trusted people who came via Kuruman and came with the blessing of his friend, Robert Moffat. And he trusted nobody else who came from any other direction. You had to come via Kuruman. Otherwise, Mzilikazi was not happy. And so that Dr. Andrew Smith and his party, large party, together with Robert Moffat, they came in 1835, and they met with Mzilikazi at Moseja. And there was this wonderfully talented young artist as part of the expedition. His name was Charles Bell. And we have these historically very valuable drawings of their time that they spent with Mzilikazi. And this is the first meeting of Dr. Andrew Smith. You see him on the left there. He's obviously sitting on a chair with a hat on, and Mzilikazi seated to his right. And the story was that Andrew Smith and Robert Moffat had brought with them to the meeting their folding camp chairs. But Mzilikazi did not have a chair. So Robert Moffat gave Mzilikazi his chair, and he sat on the ground at Mzilikazi's feet. Tells you a lot about the man, Robert Moffat. I love the picture that is created by this drawing, this meeting, a meeting between equals. Andrew Smith, Mzilikazi, as they share the food together, they discuss the important affairs that need to be discussed. Another illustration by Charles Bell that I love. We see Mzilikazi seated on the left, and all of these Matabele warriors. And Charles Bell's final title for this picture was rather grand. He called it Concert Under the Patronage of Mzilikazi. But written very faintly in pencil above that is his original title for the drawing, which was simply Matabele singing. And that's exactly what this is. Mzilikazi sitting there, his warriors sitting reverently at his feet, singing his praises. And I love the way Mzilikazi is portrayed in this illustration. He's a powerful figure, physically powerful, personality is powerful, and he sits there deep in thought as he hears his warriors reverently singing his praises. At the end of this visit from Dr. Andrew Smith, Mzilikazi actually sent one of his most senior Ndunas, Mkumbate, back with Dr. Andrew Smith all the way to Cape Town to sign a treaty of friendship with the governor of the Cape Colony representing the British Empire. Again, Mzilikazi was a very wise man, and he understood the growing power of the British Empire in South Africa. He wanted to sign that peace treaty. And Mkumbate was away for more than a year, but the treaty was signed. 1836, another interesting visitor. He was a British Army officer. He had served in India. His name was Captain William Cornwallis Harris. But he came to hunt. He was just passionate about hunting. If it moved, he wanted to shoot it. He particularly wanted to shoot big things, elephants, giraffe. So again, he came via Kuruman. So Mzilikazi was fine with that. And again, he came. This time, Mzilikazi was at Gabeni. And there, Captain Harris met with him. He was also an artist, not quite as good as Charles Bell, but he gave us what is the closest that we have to essentially a portrait of Mzilikazi. And Cornwallis Harris tells us in his book that Mzilikazi was wearing 3 green feathers on his head. They were signifying his royalty. So that was 1836. Later that year, August 1836, there were more visitors, but they were not welcome. Voortrekkers. And the beginning of the trouble is that they did not come via Kuruman. They did not come with Robert Moffat's blessing. They simply crossed the Vaal River from the south and moved into Mzilikazi's territory. And they wore European-style clothes. They rode horses. They had guns. They looked like Griquas. They were not trusted. And there were 2 parties of Voortrekkers that crossed over the Vaal, the Erasmus party and the Liebenberg party. And they were attacked by a Matabele impi. And most of them were killed. And Mzilikazi was alarmed by these new visitors. And he learned that there was a much larger group of them in what is today the Northern Free State. They had gathered there after these attacks, and they had formed a lager. I'm sure you know what that is. You see the ox wagon there in this wonderful painting by Thomas Baines. Those wagons were a means of transport, but they could also become a formidable means of defense. They could be chained together in a circle, spaces underneath, between them, thickly packed with the branches from thorn trees. That was the lager. And these Voortrekkers had formed themselves into a lager near to a koppie that became known as Vegkop. And Mzilikazi sent an army, possibly as many as 5,000 warriors, under Kalipi, one of his generals, to attack the Voortrekkers. And in October 1837, the Battle of Vegkop was fought. There were about 40 Voortrekker men against these thousands of Matabele warriors. And the battle raged the whole day, but the Voortrekkers kept them out of the lager. And in the center of the lager, the women and the children were reloading the guns for the men to fire. And one of those children was an 11-year-old boy. His name was Paul Kruger. We're on his farm today. Here's another very direct connection with this history of Mzilikazi and the Ndebele nation. So the Voortrekkers managed to defend themselves, but the Ndebele took all their cattle, 5,000, including all the oxen used to pull the ox wagons. They took all their sheep, 50,000 sheep, went back to Mosecha. The Voortrekkers were in a lot of trouble. They were then helped by a Tswana community, the Baralong, who lent them oxen so they could pull their wagons south to the mission station at Tabanshu. But the Voortrekkers were led by this man, Hendrik Potgieter, another bull. And he decided he needed to take action. He wanted his cattle and his sheep back, for starters, but he wanted to break the power of the Ndebele. And so in January 1837, Hendrik Potgieter put together a group of a few hundred armed Voortrekkers, but they had allies. Who were the allies? Griquas, and some Tswana warriors as well. And they traveled hundreds of kilometers to Mosecha, and they drove the Ndebele out and they destroyed Mosecha. The troubles continued in that year for Mzilikazi. In about June 1837, the Zulus came back again. Once again, marched more than 500 kilometers from Zululand, and a huge battle was fought somewhere near the Pilanesberg. Probably one of the biggest battles that has ever been fought in South Africa. Unfortunately, we have very little information about it. But again, an indecisive battle, though it does seem that a lot of cattle was captured by the Zulu and possibly a lot of the sheep that had come from the Voortrekkers, and they now went off to Zululand. So that was June 1837. And Hendrik Potgieter wasn't finished yet either. November 1837, once again, the Voortrekkers came, and this time they attacked Gabeni. And a 9-day battle was fought, but eventually the Ndebele had to withdraw to the north. Once again, Mzilikazi made a momentous decision. He decided he had to move his people far to the north. And it seems that one of his generals, Kalipi, who had led the force at Vechop, had been on cattle raiding expeditions up far to the north into what is today Zimbabwe. And so that became the destination. And so in 1838, the Ndebele started to move northwards. When they came to the Tswapong Hills, which is in what is today eastern Botswana, they actually split into 2 groups. And Mzilikazi himself went to the northwest towards the Makarikari salt pans, whereas Kalipi, who is now known in the accounts as Gundwane, moved to the northeast up into western Zimbabwe. Why did they split? Almost certainly keeping options open. Yes, they knew there was a possibility in what is today Zimbabwe, but Mzilikazi wanted to have a look to the northwest as well. So Gundwane's group arrived close to the Matopo Hills, and for more than a year, they heard nothing about Mzilikazi. This is now 1839. And after more than a year, Kalipi decided Mzilikazi must have died. And he decided to appoint Mzilikazi's son, Nkulumane, as the king. But Mzilikazi was very much alive. He had got to the Makarikari salt pans. That's what it looks like today. It's incredibly dry, arid, hostile environment. He had tried going further north, but he encountered the hostile Kololo people. So Mzilikazi too decided to move east into what is today western Zimbabwe. And so he arrived close to this mountain which became known as Taba Nzinduna. And there he discovered that Kalipi had appointed his son, Nkulumane, as the king. And Mzilikazi was enraged. He deposed Nkulumane. Nkulumane fled southwards. He fled all the way here. He took refuge amongst the Bafokeng. In fact, he is buried here in Phokeng. Kalipi was executed. So were the elders who had supported Nkulumane becoming king, and hence the name of the mountain, Taba Nzinduna. But now, finally, Mzilikazi people had found a home that they could settle in. So this is 1839. And in fact, for more than 50 years, they enjoyed a period of prosperity here in western Zimbabwe. They became the dominant power in that part of the world. 1854, Mzilikazi signed a peace treaty with the Voortrekkers. 1854 as well, his old friend Robert Moffat came to visit him after they'd not seen each other for 19 years. It was an emotional reunion. It's quite touching to read Moffat's account in his journals of how he and Mzilikazi were reunited in 1854. Moffat came back again, and keep in mind, from Kuruman to Bulawayo in an ox wagon, it takes a long time. That is a long journey. That is a journey of months. But he came again in 1857 and one last time in 1864. And finally, in 1868, Mzilikazi died. But he was well into his 70s. He was succeeded by his son, Lobengula. And it really was only with the arrival of the Rhodesian Pioneer Column in 1890 that the dominance of the Ndebele in the Zimbabwe region finally came to an end. To conclude, what shall we say about the man Mzilikazi? Firstly, he was a survivor. It's actually quite astonishing that in a period of violent conflict, he survived all the way through and lived to be well into his 70s. Secondly, he was a powerful warrior, and he was a very capable military leader. Thirdly, he was a bold decision maker. He was faced over and over again with these momentous decisions, but he did not shrink back, even if he knew that his decision meant moving his people for hundreds of kilometers to a new home. Fourthly, he was a mighty king, and he was greatly revered by his people. And finally, he was a great man who profoundly changed the history of Southern Africa. So today, we remember and we honor Nkosi Mazilikazi ka Mashobane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre, for the intriguing scholarship. You've presented it with so much passion. We truly appreciate. Earlier, I referenced Nkosi ubulalane ka Mashobane, izingane ka Mashobane, mphosisile. So ngiyaxolisa Nkosi. Right. Now on the line is Ancestral Voices by Terence Ball. Terence.
Well, how do you follow that? An address by a Zulunga and then an academic, and suddenly I'm called upon. Bayete Nkosi, bayete. Dikhoshi, Kialibucha, I'm happy to be here. And we'll use some Setswana Dumela Bachetsu. You know, the ancestors work in strange ways. I had prepared my speech, and I had a feeling. Just look at these writings. We are joined by descendants of the authors. I'll tell you more about them later. This I'm going to read to you is a writing called The History of the Batlako of Mabe, written in Setswana in 1935 by J. Masiangwako. Now, he was born obviously much earlier than that. So what I want to say is this: the tribal totem of the Batlako is the elephant. They are the Matabele who stayed behind when Mzilikazi was on his way to Bulawayo. Your brother cousins are here. You are all relatives. Sorry, but some of them are not Matabele, and we do not know how it came to be that they should take the elephant of the Matabele as their totem. It may be seen that during the war of Mzilikazi, as he went along, some of the people turned back when they were in the territory of the Bangwato or the Bakwena. On their return, they came with some of the people of the Bangwato, near Baputi. The Batlako honor the elephant because it is their totem. They neither touch it nor eat its flesh. The elephant is the totem of the chief's family, and all the people honor it. They are known as the Batlako. Their totem is the elephant, and although, in fact, it is their totem, the people belong to the chief, and that is why they adopted the totem, knowing very well what they are and what their totem is. When a person regards a certain animal as his totem, he may not touch it with his hands. The moment he does so, his body becomes frayed, and that is the skin of his body begins to fall off, which necessitates him being doctored. So I wanted to read that because it links the Setswana-speaking people sitting here today and those descendants of Mzilikazi ka Mashobane who traveled that long journey. I have a remarkable job. I first became involved in heritage matters when I had a meeting with 3 friends of mine in a rural village called Vuwani in Vembe. 2 of them are Chitsonga speakers. 1, Ngobeni of Amashangana heritage. the other Maluleke, a Vatsonga, and Konanani Mativa, a Chivenda speaker. And they were asking me about the history of the first encounters between their ancestors and the role of the Portuguese in those meetings. And that is why we started our history series, our story, with the Battle of Mshlathuzi River. And then, who fought there? Zwide Kalanga, Shoshangan Kanumalo, Zwangindaba Kachele, Shaka Kasenza Kakona, Mzilikazi ka Mashobane. And so it made sense to write about those people. And to add also then other South Africans, Sekhukhune. We also looked further north to the kings of the Vavenda, Dibanyika, Makado, and so on. I went to visit an academic, Chivenda-speaking gentleman, Dr. Nemuzavadi, sadly now no longer with us. He was very old. He was very enthused by what I showed him, and he then said to me, Terence, please, please, please go to the University of Pretoria and see what they've got there, and see if you can give our ancestors their voices back again. I had no idea what he was talking about. I went to the university and to the Special Collections Unit and was shown a room with many cardboard boxes in it, full of handwritten manuscripts and typewriter-written or typed documents. 19,000 A4 pages, written by 186 authors in 7 of our 9 official indigenous languages, all mother tongue speakers of the language they wrote in. Why only 7 languages? Because nearly 100 years ago, when these writings were written, Siswati and Isindebele were not written languages. The very first writing that I had translated was in isiZulu, a writing from isiZulu, written by Dorothy Shomase, and she titled it The Zulu War and the Mzilikazi Faction. It was written in 1939. We think she was a nun. We know she was at Nklopenkulu Mission. And these are the words. I heard this story of the Anglo-Zulu War and the civil war that followed from a person who was there. He was a warrior, and his name was Somushungwana Magwaza. And I wrote this while he spoke. He saw all these things. The only known writing by a warrior who fought against the English. It's extraordinary. I couldn't believe what I was reading because there were apparently no stories, no information of this kind. Now, as I say, bear in mind, if Dorothy Shomase was about 50 years old, she would have been born in 1880. Her grandparents would have been alive when Shaka was ruling. In fact, she also interviewed a very old lady, and I'll see if I can find this. I heard the story of Nkabahlanzi and Kababomvu from a grandmother who gave birth to Pifeni here at Nklopenkulu near Ngoma. For I was writing as she spoke, and her age is such that she was born while Mpande reigned, but she is about to die. So now you read a traditional folk tale of the Amazulu told to you by an ancestor who was born when King Mpande was ruling. There is nothing, it is a national heritage treasure. And I hesitate to say a South African heritage treasure, a Southern African heritage treasure. So I am not going to keep you for very long. You've heard far more expertise from others than you have from me. But I will tell you a little about what has happened to this the series, the Ancestral Voices series, and its growing acceptance by a number of academics and others to the value of these works. We received the following citation. In researching a particular area of interest, I found information on the ancestral voices which enriched my understanding of the traditional practices. These writings represent a valuable repository of traditional knowledge which might otherwise have been lost. Professor Mondi Makiwana. Prof cited volume 4 of the isiXhosa translations written by Nkosi Makalima in his latest research on initiations in the Eastern Cape. The research was commissioned by the UN and is still in draft format. So it's wonderful to have that kind of academic expertise. What I find more wonderful in situations such as this is Mr. Cullen Mackenzie and I recently returned from the OASA, the Oral History Association of South African Conference. And I noticed that there was a isiXhosa speaking gentleman there. And in my best isiXhosa, ke molo Mzilikazi, njani ma, itipililo mkonto mjani ma. And I showed him a book on his people. And he suddenly stopped and he said, "This is my grandfather." For the first time in the history of this country, mother tongue indigenous language speakers at schools in villages across the country are going to read about their own village, Mabiskra, written by their own people in their mother tongue, about every aspect of their history and culture. It is also the largest collection of what is now called IKS, Indigenous Knowledge Systems, about the stars. The other aspect is to try and discover the meanings of words that have fallen into disuse and their meanings have been forgotten. We have translated a fraction of the Sesotho Salibua writings. We've come across 300 words that the speakers no longer know the meaning of. And they tend to relate to traditional medicine. There is a lot written about traditional medicine. Please look at the books. You'll see the outside of the other languages. Setswana is in here simply because it is a celebration of Mzilikazi Mashobane, who lived in this area, and indeed of Setswana. And I'm pleased to say that both the chair and the editor-in-chief of the Setswana lexicography unit are here with us. Thank you for attending. And I'm going to close by reading a brief extract from Swazi and Zulu history written in isiZulu in 1939 by G.S. Dlamini. Gocha was the father of Songia, the mother of Mpande Numpetu, daughter of Zwide, who entered Mashobane's house, the Kumalo clan, and gave birth to Mzilikazi.
Thank you so very much, Terence, for bringing us the ancestral voices. You know, I earlier forgot to mention that in our presence we also have Princess Hlengwe Zulu of Indlunkulu of the house of KwaMinyamanzi. We truly appreciate your presence. We also have the presence of Princess Azola Mabinza of the Mabinza royal family, Xhosa Kingdom in the Eastern Cape. Siyajabula kakhulu. Siyabulela for your presence. We're now going to have a quick reading from students on traditional writings. It's going to be quick before we all move to the main event, which we're going to hand over to His Majesty the King, Vulelani Mashobane. Students.
History ya Bafokeng Parastenburg. E fetoletswe go tswa mo lelemeng la Sejatlhapi go ya mo lelemeng la Setswana ka ngwaga wa 1939. Yona e fetoletswe ke Rre JSR Mokgwatlheng yo o tshotsweng ka ngwaga wa 1991 mme a tlhokafala ka ngwaga wa 1989. Morago ga ntwa ya Mapedi, Noge a itira kgosi ka nkane mme ga tsoga botsolodi jo bogolo ka ntlha ya ga Noge le Nameng. Fa Bafokeng ba ntse ba lwantshana, bana ba tlhaselwa ke matebele a Mzilikazi a matshwane go tswa ka fa letlhakoreng ka tshoganyetso. Mzilikazi a leleka mephato ya ga Nameng le ya ga Noge mme Nameng a bolawa. Noge o ne a kgabaganya noka ya Odi mme a kopana le mogolowe Thote mo nageng ka fa letlhakoreng leno la noka ya Odi. Noge a mmolaya. Morago ga moo, mokgatlhe wa Tautona Theothe a nna kgosi. Kgosi Mokgatle a ya go kopa thuso kwa Maburung kwa nokeng ya Odi. Bafokeng le Maburu ba ne ba fenya matebele a ga Kgosi Mzilikazi go tswa kwa Bafokeng. Kgosi Mzilikazi a tshabela kwa Bulawane kwa Rhodesia. Ke a leboga.
Gompieno ke tlile go bala temana ka hisetori ya Batlokwa. Hisetori ya Batlokwa e fetoletswe go tswa mo lelemeng la Sejatlhapi go ya kwa lelemeng la Setswana. E fetoletswe ke Kgosi KP Sedumedi ka ngwaga wa 1938. Ene o tsetswe ka ngwaga wa 1967 mme a tlogela lefatshe le le ka kwano ka ngwaga wa 1947. Kgosi e kgolo Matlapeng a sala a busa mo dithabeng tse di bidiwang Moreteletsi. Ka dintwa fa Matebele a tsena mo Transvaal. Matebele a feta Kgosi Matlapeng a agile mo letlhakeng. A fuduga mo letlhakeng, a ya Moreteletsi gwate Rietfontein. A agateng Kgosi Matlapeng. A tsala Gaborone le monnawe Sedumedi. Ka nako eo ke fa Maburu a tsena mo lefatsheng la Bokone le Transvaal. Maburu ba tla ba tswa kwa Gabone ba rakana le Matebele. Le bone Maburu ba falletse kwa ba tswang teng. Le bona ba tlile go ipatlela manno mo lefatsheng la Batswana. Matebele a bolaya Batswana le Batswana ba bolaya Matebele. Mazulu a bolaya Maburu le Maburu a bolaya Mazulu. Ya nna dintwantwa. Matebele ba fetela kwa tlase ga dinoka ba re ke kwa Bulawane kwa North East ba ya go agateng. Kgosi ya Mazulu Mzilikazi Mashobane a tswa KwaZulu-Natal. Ke a leboga.
Yo emeng fa pele ga lona ke re se go kgosi ya gae ke tswa kwa sekolong se se golwane sa Matale Secondary. Mme ke tlile go le anegela ka hisetori ya Batlhako. Hisetori ya Batlhako e fetoletswe go tswa mo lelemeng la Sejatlhapi go ya kwa lelemeng la Setswana ke moruti P Kgaswe ka ngwaga wa 1939. Ena o bonwe ka ngwaga wa 1875 a tlogela lefatshe le le ka kwano ka ngwaga wa 1943. Ke tlhago le maina a dikgosi tsa Batlhako ka fa ba tlhagileng ka teng jaaka re tsere mo melomong ya boraetso mo kitsong e ba e kgonneng. Ke raya Batlhako ba ba binang tlou. Tlhago ya rona ke Matebele. Ba tlhaga kwa Botlhabatsatsi ntlheng ya Pretoria Tshwane. Ba re kgosi ya rona fa re kgaogana kwa Pretoria mo tlase ga thaba e bidiwang ka leina le le reng Sakaleng. Batlhako ba ne ba eteletswe pele ke Kgosi Thulelanko. Morago ba tloga mo thabeng eo ya Sakalengwe ba leba kwa thabeng ya Tlhogokgolo e bidiwang Voluderskop kajeno. Ke mo go fitlhileng ga sala Batlhako ba ga Mogale mme e le bone ba bagolo mo go rona. Ke mo go ileng ga tswa Kgosi Mogale wa Thatu ya Kgomo a leba ka Batlhako kwa dithabaneng tsa Makgope tse go agileng Batlokwa mo go tsone. Batlokwa ba ga Motsatsi tlhole kajeno ba ntse ba na le ditsebe tse di tletlilweng, ditsebe e le Matebele. Se ke sa tshwareng pila ke lebololo gore ba le simolotse kwa kae mme fela ke gone mo ba ileng ba fetoga. Ka leboga.
Ngizacela umbulazi lo babukhumalo Bonwell lisiphathele umsebenzi lo olandelayo, which is going to be conducted at the unveiling of His Majesty the King Mzilikazi Mashobane.
Siyathi mnyama iyajama kwathi amadoda amadala akwaqelana sedlesi bukhalisi kaMashobane umzaco omnyama kaMashobane owanqandisa inkomo labantu kwathi utshani bude busemahalikhale abushi nabutsha kothi mhlabuthayo bekutshana emithi amadoda obabebanzima mhla kwaleyo mini kwabasingethe bencelisa labakhulelweyo tshetshanovane khozela umathi kwabanzi inyoni kasigunyana kodwa ekhwapheni bafihla abantwana emabeleni bayethe amandla inkosi yasilawula ngamandla inkosi yasilawula ilesiwe sinyameza